Hello, my name is Kate Mahoney, and I'm the Executive Director of the Naomi Ruth Cohen Institute for Mental Health Education at the Chicago School of Professional Psychology. I'm really excited today that we're joined by an expert, Cheryl Judice, who is an expert on interracial relationships. And so Cheryl is a researcher. She's a college professor at Northwestern University and has done extensive research on a topic that is often overlooked even in the conversation about interracial relationships, which is about interracial relationships between Black women and white men. So Cheryl, I was excited in 2018, the very last issue of the Chicago Tribune, when I saw Heidi Stevens' column that said 10 top books that I loved and learned from in 2018. And there was your book on the same list with Michelle Obama's book. And so it made me think, you're such an expert and so great at helping people understand and learn, that I would ask you a little bit more about kind of what brought you to research this topic, and a little bit about, as you've gone out, I know you've been really on the circuit sharing information, kind of the reactions and how people are responding to what your research shares.
Well, Kate, I got involved in this research almost now 20 years ago. It's no secret that there are very different dating and marriage patterns in the African American community. Mm-hmm. And in fact, when I was thinking about this topic, I was remembering all the different Black women that I've encountered throughout the last 20, 25 years, older than me, younger than me, who have never found a satisfying and fulfilling romantic relationship. And as a result of that, they remained single. And none of them ever thought that they should look outside of the race for a spouse. And so consequently, what wound up happening is that they were single. The other thing, of course, is that it's not as common for Black women to be married outside of the race as it is for other groups of women. And when you compare Black women versus Black men marry outside of the race almost 4 times as frequently as Black women. And so consequently, Black women have been kind of trained to think that their only romantic outlet can be, if they find a nice, eligible Black man. And that's a problem because one of the things that also never gets to come out is the fact that from age 16 forward, Black women outnumber Black men. By the time you get to the 29-year-old age group, for every 3 Black women, there are only 2 Black men.
So that sounds really unequal. And when I think about age 29 is often for people who are really interested in, particularly in marriage and settling down and even perhaps having a family, at 29, 30 is really about the time that people are kind of pairing up.
That's right.
And settling in. And so thinking that if you're a Black woman, that by that point in time, the odds are kind of against you.
They are.
Is got to be really disheartening for somebody who really wants to find a life partner.
It is. And in fact, where you start seeing it most prominently is on the college campuses. When these young girls, young Black females, start looking around for dating partners, they quickly realize that there are far more of them on college campuses than there are Black men. So, but for many of them, as I said, they are very reluctant to think outside of the race. And that has resulted in all kinds of problems socially.
Well, and I found reading your research really interesting. And there were a couple, I think there were some key points you kind of identified as why Black women might be reluctant to kind of look outside their race. And can you talk about a few of those?
Sure. There have been some very negative historical relationships between Black men and white women. And that kind of has set the stage. That's one of the very first things.
From white men and Black women.
Sure.
Right.
I mean, but again, that's not everybody. Mm-hmm. But again, just generally, broadly speaking, the relationships have never been viewed as sincerely romantic where they've occurred. I mean, a Black woman may oftentimes be viewed as fulfilling a white man's fantasy.
Yep.
And that's some of the reluctance that Black women have in dating outside the race because they don't want to be anybody's social experiment. And that, again, has some ramifications. But the desire also not to marry outside of the race or date outside of the race also comes from time to time from their families, where they're not comfortable having someone outside outside the race in the family. Again, they're very wary about these kinds of things. And again, something not mentioned often, but that's equally true, is low self-esteem. Many black women, we grow up in a society that's unrelentless in its promotion of white women as being the best of the women, the best, highest standard of beauty. Well, these are not qualities that black women can compete with. So consequently, they're far more reluctant to think outside of the race because it's a novel idea to think that anyone other than a black man would be attracted to them or attracted by them.
Well, and I think you're right. Our culture, sadly, our society in America anyhow, has promoted a certain pretty narrow image of what is attractive. And I mean, I think back to some of the research I remember reading, even with small children, about picking a doll.
That's right.
And looking a certain way, wanting, the blonde-haired, blue-eyed doll, what's attractive.
Right.
It also seemed, though, that then a white man who might be attracted to or interested in a black woman might really have to prove himself to say, I'm sincere, I'm interested in you, I find you attractive, compatible, smart, engaging, supportive.
Right.
So I can almost see that, from some of the research that you shared with me, that somebody who was interested, a white man would really have to
Right.
work hard to prove that he's being sincere, and it's not his idea of a walk on the wild side or something, but that he's looking for a life partner.
Exactly. In fact, you reminded me of a funny story. One couple I interviewed, the man, who was white, he was so interested in dating black women, but didn't have any access to them, so he decided that he was going to join a black dating website. And he then was able to attract some black women who thought he was black. And the one woman he attracted, she was just astounded when she realized that he was white. She shows up for their date, and he introduces himself, and she said, "Wait a minute, you were supposed to be black," and because of the subterfuge, she said, "How should I trust you in anything else?
Right.
You won't even tell me right from the beginning that you're not black. That you don't pretend to be white." But they did go on to have a relationship, and they did get married.
And what did you find as you did your research in terms of the reactions of friends, coworkers, extended family members? Did that seem to be a pretty broad spectrum of how people responded?
Indeed it did. Where you found black women, they grew up, and it's almost a little bit class-based, and I know you and I are both in sociology, so we kind of look at those factors first. Where you found black women that grew up in integrated communities, and where they were accustomed to going to school with and participating in sports and other activities with whites, most often they did not have problems with family members when it came to dating outside the race. They might have a few questions from the girlfriends like, "Wait, what are you doing crossing over?" that kind of thing. But generally speaking, they didn't have much resistance or find much resistance to dating outside the race. Where there was a problem, it was where you would find a young black woman who grew up in a predominantly black neighborhood, maybe not so well off financially. The interactions with white had been minimal at best. Mm-hmm. These kinds of relationships, forming those kind of relationships was was more difficult for some of these women. It's like one young woman told me, "My parents don't have black friends." So she knew that going into it that there was going to be some social awkwardness simply because it's just such a novel idea. And of course her father was very suspicious as to why this young man would be interested in his daughter.
Right.
But then that tough couple too was able to bridge the gap, and they went on and got married.
I do want to remind callers that you are welcome to call in, that it's so great that we have an expert here who's done so much research on this topic that is really important. And again, I think as I've talked to people about it, a lot of people have said, well, gee, I feel like we've made such great strides and you see so many more interracial couples. But I've pointed out, but take a look, as you say that, how many of those interracial couples that you know or that you see in your local restaurant or out to the theater are black women with white men, because that is, as you mentioned, quite a minority. I was also fascinated by your research, though, about for those who not only dated but went on to get married, some of the data about really the strength and stability of these interracial marriages where you have a black woman married to a white man. And can you remind me a little bit about what that data was? I was struck by it.
It was very interesting when I found this. Here is the mark, the benchmark that I'm referring to. At the 10-year mark, wedding anniversary, at the 10th year of being married, Black women married to white men had a 43% greater likelihood of still being married than white couples.
Wow.
Okay? So in other words, those relationships, when they do occur, tended to be very stable. The opposite is true for Black men. Black men who are married to white women, at the 10-year anniversary mark, they had up to a 40% greater likelihood of being divorced than white couples.
Wow.
Yeah.
So that's a very large gap,
Yes.
and it's something really interesting for people to take a look at.
Yes, and there are several reasons for that, Kate. Number one among them is where you find Black women married to white men. These relationships tend to be very egalitarian. The interracial couples of either pattern are likely to be older somewhat than first-time couples marrying. So that's the first thing. You have an age factor. But the second thing is, as I said, among the couples that I have interviewed where the relationships have been very successful, the couples are comparably educated, oftentimes in the same professions, and so the degree of compatibility is greater just going into the relationship.
Sure.
You know, there is a stereotype of the wealthier Black man marrying a poor Black woman. Oftentimes those relationships are not as egalitarian. So, you know, think of the stereotype, the Black athlete making a lot of money with his, his white wife. And so consequently, the basis of compatibility may not be as strong as it would be the other way around.
And then what about the issue about about people choosing to have children together, and again, how family members and others respond to children who are multiracial children and their cultural identities?
Well, I'll tell you, interestingly enough, in neither group that I've studied, either version of interracial marriages, interracial couples, Black men with white women or the reverse pattern, you will find that most people are able to blend their cultures. You don't find much antipathy, these are Black kids or these are just this. People blend. And oftentimes how the children identified is based on how they look. And that's important as well. But I haven't come across any couples that want to eradicate one side of the racial ethnic divide than the other. They very simply blend what they have and honor both people's cultures and holiday habits and so on and so forth.
Which can be a great strength then for those children, because they learn so much from both cultures, and sometimes more than two, right? If they're looking at cultural extended family, and they really get a really solid foundation, it sounds like. Yeah. So why do you think more Black women are not married to white men?
Well, because as I said, there's some very strong cultural restraints that operate against this. The first thing is that Black women are very loyal to the idea of saving the race, for lack of a way of describing it. It's the whole idea that we are the cultural preservers, and despite all the negative things that may happen to Black men, Black women need to be there to hold on to the race and keep things moving forward. And Black women are very well, they're very well attuned to that. And I think any group of women, I don't care what your racial ethnic group, you want to preserve your culture. So it's not unusual that, Black women would feel the same way. So but that I think is the overarching thing. And then as I said, you have issues of, low self-esteem. I'm not going to step outside of this box and this boundary. But those that I'd say would be the two main things.
And when you think more in terms of where people meet, how these relationships get started, you mentioned on college campuses is one place. And where were some of the other places? And you mentioned the internet, dating service, right?
Most people met at school that I interviewed. Many of them met in the service. That's another well-kept secret. Many interracial couples meet in the service. There's something about being in a situation where both of your lives are on the line that eliminates some social barriers that may be in place in other kinds of circumstances, so that allowed for deeper relationships. Another place they meet is at church. Even though church attendance has been on the decline in this country for many, many years, still there are many churches that have singles groups. And these singles groups tend to attract people that really want to find someone. And so even though they may not be heavy duty into the religious ideology, they do use churches for these social experiences that they get to have. So, and then as I said, at school and at work. I mean, that's one of the main things, at work. And most often when I say they meet at school, I mean at professional schools, graduate school, law school, medical school, those kinds of things.
Absolutely. That makes a lot of sense in terms of that. So again, if someone were thinking now, you know, and there may be some women who in the past were very clear that they wanted to find a partner, life partner within their race, but maybe based on time passage or even hopefully some things evolving in our country and culture, people are thinking maybe they will broaden their horizons. So these ideas about ways and places people might meet. Do you think people are do fixing up of friends across races much, or?
Surprisingly, Kate, that has happened in a couple of cases. What I had, it was very interesting. There was one black woman who met her husband. She had gone to grad school, and she was living in a graduate dorm. And her roommate met her and said, you know, I have this guy that I just know you all are going to get along so well.
You'd be a good match.
And so sure enough, they introduced each other, and consequently this couple now has been married about 10, 15 years. Now, the interesting thing about that's more of a new phenomenon. I cannot imagine something like this occurring before this, you know, more time, 10, 15 years ago. But she said she had no, you know, reservations about introducing her, and they're all still good friends now.
That's wonderful.
Yes.
You know, Cheryl, we actually have a caller.
Okay.
So let's see our caller. Caller, we'd like to hear your question and see what questions you have for our expert here, Cheryl Judice.
Hi. Yeah, I guess this is just so much new information for me, and I guess I'm wondering what Cheryl might say. What's her main point that she wants to be sure viewers kind of take away? I'm just kind of blown away by all this research and information.
Well, I'll tell you, the main point I hope to take away, that everyone will take away from this, and that is that I want every black woman to feel as free and confident as any other group of women to date and marry whomever they wish.
Well, and what I love, and I'm actually going to show your website really quickly so people can see that, is that this really started as your doctoral, your dissertation, your doctoral research. So this is really comes from. You share a lot of stories, and I think people are really interested in hearing that. You've really did some really great research. It's behind this. So, you know, your expertise, and again, as I hear that people are coming out to hear you talk, that's one of the reasons I thought having you on the show is a nice way for people to learn more, is really interesting. So I think that notion in terms of people maybe checking out your website who are interested in the research behind it, some of the data that we've talked about tonight, would be really of great interest.
Well, Kate, you know, I must tell you, since I've been doing this research, I have probably interviewed close to 250 to 300 people.
Wow.
Over the course of the last 15 years. So I'm really confident that the information that I've gleaned has been the truth. When I interview people, I've interviewed them with their spouses, without their spouses. I want to see if people are giving me the good story or giving me the truth. And, you know, I'm a sociologist after all. We have to, you know, look at reliability of data and all of that. And I've been very pleased that I've been very forthcoming and generous in sharing their most intimate lives with me.
Which I think is incredible. I mean, I think that speaks to who you are, both as a researcher, but as a person, and how comfortable you make people feel in talking to you. I think our viewers probably see this. And it was, to me, really interesting that you also included, even though, you know, again, your research is a lot about the relationships and trying to, you know, I think encourage people to open their minds to possibilities. You did interview people who ended up getting married, but then marriages ended.
Right.
And for those marriages that did end in divorce, how many of those seem to be about race, and how many seem to be about some of the other things that are the, you know, sort of the downside of, or that bring on the ends of other marriages?
Okay. Well, with the exception of just one couple, you know, in my current book, I have interviewed 10 couples where they are now divorced. And of the 10 couples that I included in this book, only one couple divorced based on what I would say would be racial issues. Everybody else that wound up divorced got divorced for the same reasons other people get divorced. There was nothing that stuck out in that. But let me explain to you how race played out in this one relationship.
Okay.
This young woman had grown up in a very privileged environment, boarding schools, so on and so forth, met her husband, went to school out east, college, the whole bit. And she had not really enjoyed or had much of what we would call a typical black experience, meaning she didn't grow up in any kind of situation where there was any kind of deficiency in how she lived her life in any way. And consequently, she met this young white man who also who grew up in very kind of privileged circumstances as well, and they went on and they got married. Well, what happened to her is after they were married for a few years, she began to notice that, she started working more with black people and black men, and she noticed how these men worked really hard for everything they had, and then she'd come home and she recognized that her husband, he really didn't have to work as hard as these men that she was working with. And it began to make her think a little more deeply about the different racial experiences groups have. And then the kind of coup d'etat, and what brought the marriage down, was how, her husband was very comfortable accepting money from his family while they were in grad school. His family thought nothing about subsidizing their lifestyle and the apartments they lived in. And in fact, there was always the idea if they wanted to live a place and they couldn't afford the nices of, on their own salary, the parents were happy to subsidize them, okay, and happy to set aside trust money for kids and all that. And number one, she recognized that her family couldn't do this, so it's kind of one-sided. But number two, she thought, but if we have children, these are black children, and they are going to grow up with a kind of
sense of entitlement, right?
Right. And she didn't want that to be. So over time, as her own consciousness about black life, the wide variety, I should say, of black experiences, because they're not monolithic in any way.
Absolutely not.
But she became more aware of that. She decided that, moving forward, that this was not a relationship that was going to be able to be sustained, because she just wasn't comfortable accepting the other family money.
Yep. Yeah. So that almost sounds a little bit more like class than race,
yes, exactly.
Although confounding a little bit with her core values, which is you have to work hard for what you want and need, and that she would want her children to incorporate those same values.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So that is an interesting issue, but it really sounds like, when people can get beyond the initial barriers and allow themselves to connect and then figure out, is this a good match for me? Is this somebody who treats me well, that I'm attracted to, that I feel like we share values and could really be life partners?
Right.
That when people make it through those early steps, once they get to a place where they would be considering marriage, that those marriages really have lasting power. And so, that's, I think, something that would surprise some people when they read your research or, recognize. And even, again, thinking about you being in a university setting, being a professor at Northwestern, the fact that you're out there talking and that you're also out talking to community groups is really powerful. And back when I think about, this series we're part of here, focus on the family, helping people think about what they want moving forward. And again, it doesn't sound like you're recommending everybody do this. You're just saying,
I'm saying this is an option.
Right.
And the other thing, Kate, I think is important for your audience to know is that I'm married to a black man. Oftentimes people think that, you're pushing your own agenda. That's not the case. My husband is African American, but he too shares my view that if women don't think outside of the race, black women don't think outside the race, he's seen enough of it himself, women that are single and never have found someone.
Well, we will let him be our final word. I can't believe how quickly our time went by.
I can't either.
I want to thank you, Cheryl Judice, for coming on and sharing your research and helping people think about really important issues of our day. So thank you so much.
And thank you for having me.